The French Revolution set Europe ablaze. It was an age of enlightenment and progress, but also of tyranny and oppression. It was an age of glory and an age of tragedy. One man stood above it all. This was the Age of Napoleon. I'm Everett Rummage, host of the Age of Napoleon podcast. Join me as I examine the life and times of one of the most fascinating and enigmatic characters in modern history. Look for the Age of Napoleon wherever you find your podcasts.
I'm Jeffrey Rosen, President and CEO of the National Constitution Center. A few years ago, learning about the forgotten meaning of the pursuit of happiness changed my life. When the founders wrote that famous phrase in the Declaration of Independence, they meant an ongoing commitment to self-improvement and lifelong learning. This discovery inspired me to write a book, and in my new podcast, I explore the founders' lives with the historians who know them best. Plus, filmmaker Ken Burns shares his daily practice of self-reflection. Join me for Pursuit, the Founder's Guide to Happiness.
Welcome to Ben Franklin's World, a podcast about early American history with Liz Covart. The study of history is key to understanding who we are and how we can affect a better future. Ben Franklin's World will introduce you to historical people and events that have impacted and shaped our present-day world. And now, here's your host, Liz Covart.
Hello, and welcome to episode 39 of Ben Franklin's World, the podcast dedicated to helping you learn more about how the people and events of our early American past have shaped the present-day world we live in. Today's episode marks the third in our 5-part Happy Birthday United States series, which is dedicated to exploring the American Revolution in greater detail. And our conversation about the Revolution continues today with Eric Nelson, author of The Royalist Revolution, Monarchy, and the American Founding. Eric's book has a lot of early American historians talking about it, and they're talking about it because of the argument he makes in the book, which is that for many patriots, the American Revolution was a revolution against Parliament and not King George III and his powers. In fact, for many patriots, King George III didn't have enough power to govern the colonies the way they would have liked him to. So I wanted to have Eric on the show so you could have an opportunity to learn more about his book and his ideas about the causes of the American Revolution. During our conversation, Eric reveals not just what the Royalist Revolution was, but he gives us a lot of context for it. So before we dive headlong into the Royalist Revolution and what it is, Eric actually helps us brush up on our English constitutional history so we can better understand what powers the Constitution gave Parliament and which powers it gave to King George III. Eric also helps us understand the evolution of the different colonies and the way that Great Britain governed them. And he also helps us see why some colonists argued that King George III should have more power to govern the colonies, not less. This is a really fascinating conversation. I'm excited to bring it to you, so let's get to it.
With tidings and wisdom to share about our early American past, here is this week's special guest.
Eric Nelson is the Robert M. Barron Professor of Government at Harvard University. His research focuses on the history of political thought in early modern Europe and America. Eric has authored 3 books, including The Hebrew Republic, Jewish Sources, and the Transformation of European Political Thought, and, most recently, The Royalist Revolution, Monarchy, and the American Founding. Welcome to Ben Franklin's World, Eric.
Thank you for having me.
Eric, we're delighted to have you join us today to discuss the Royalist Revolution, which has a lot of historians talking about it because of its novel premise, that many of the patriots fought a revolution not against a king, but against a legislature, Parliament. Eric, would you tell us how you came to write about the American Revolution as a revolution against a legislature and not a king?
Sure. Well, it happened to some degree as a result of serendipity. I'm a political theorist, and most of my work focuses on the history of political thought in early modern Europe, sort of 16th and 17th centuries, and I also do some work in contemporary political philosophy. And I'd always been very interested in the political thought of the American Revolution, and I touched on the subject sort of glancingly in my first book, which was really my PhD dissertation, but it's not something that I had gone back to or supposed that I'd end up writing a book about. I ended up having a group of undergraduates come to my office at Harvard about, it's almost 5 years ago now, to complain that there was no course at the university on the American Revolution. And my initial reaction was disbelief. I sort of told them to go away and look harder. And they came back with their data, and it turned out they were absolutely right, that there was actually no course at all on the Revolution. And I thought, particularly since we were having the conversation about 200 yards from where Washington mustered the Continental Army on Cambridge Common, that we could do better than that, and I decided I would teach a course on the political thought of the Revolution, try to get my act together and do that. And so I spent a summer really sort of reading the pamphlet literature chronologically from the beginnings of the crisis in 1763 through to the ratification of the Constitution, and I was kind of consulting with various colleagues and putting together the syllabus, and really in the course of doing that work and then teaching the lecture course for the first time, which I did in 2009, I really ended up feeling that the story was rather different from the one that I had expected to find, and I became sort of fascinated by the subject and curious to see, as it were, how deep the roots of this set of ideas I found myself interested in actually extended.
The American Revolution is a very addicting research topic. I speak from personal experience.
Yes, it is.
To best understand Eric's idea that the Patriots wanted a strong monarch and not a strong legislature to govern them, we need to brush up on our English history. In the Royalist Revolution, Eric states that during the 1760s and 1770s, the Patriots wanted to turn back the clock on the English Constitution. They wanted to return to the period prior to the English Revolution, which occurred between 1640 and 1660. Eric, would you tell us about the English Constitution? Is it true that it is an unwritten constitution? And what powers did it delegate to Parliament versus the monarchy?
Well, those are sort of complicated questions, but I mean, for our purposes, the answer is that the English Constitution, as the term was used in the early modern period, particularly in the 17th century, was unwritten, which isn't to say it didn't incorporate a number of important texts, statutes, legal rulings, and so on, going back, of course, to Magna Carta and beyond. But for our purposes, it was not written down in the manner, let's say, of the U.S. Constitution, and for that reason it was much more contestable. People had different views. Of course, they have different views of what our Constitution is about as well, but let's say a fortiori, since there was no document sort of putting all of this together and giving you a kind of blueprint of the overarching system, the essentials of the Constitution were very fiercely contested all the way through the 17th century, which was in essence one kind of century-long constitutional crisis that really got going under the reign of James I and reached its first crisis in 1642 to 1649, period of the two English civil wars, ultimately resulting in the death of Charles I, the execution of Charles I in January 1649, and then the interregnum, the restoration of the monarchy in 1660, and then the Glorious Revolution in 1688-9. So it sort of just runs the whole span of the century. And chiefly, what was at issue was the extent of the prerogatives of the crown and the degree to which Parliament could tame them. And it's a story of an increasingly assertive Parliament insisting on rather sweeping new authorities to regulate and in some important cases supplant the royal prerogative. So for our purposes, the big ones, I mean the ones that were really in a serious way at issue in the period included, first of all, and maybe foremost, the king's negative voice, as it was called, which is something like we call the veto. That is, it was understood that the king was one of the estates of Parliament. That is, Parliament was a legislature, as we would say, in three branches: the House of Commons, the House of Lords, and the king. So the king was a constituent part of Parliament, and any bill, in order to become law, had to acquire the approval or the assent of each of the three branches, including the king. So a bill that passed the House of Commons and the House of Lords was submitted to the king for what was called the royal assent, and the king would either grant it, in which case the bill would become law, or he would withhold or refuse his assent, which was the equivalent of a veto. And this sort of undoubted prerogative of the crown became one of the major subjects of controversy in the opening years of the English Revolution in the 1640s. But there were also many others. So although Charles I acknowledged the right of the House of Commons, the exclusive right of the House of Commons to grant supply, which was the technical term, that is, sort of raise taxes to fund the government, and the House of Lords had its crucial prerogative of judging, and then there were other legislative prerogatives of the two houses. The government, as Charles called it, or what we would call the executive power, was entirely with the king and was beyond the competence of Parliament, including, very importantly, foreign affairs, the power to enter into treaties, the power to make war, and sort of raise armies and direct them in the field, and so on. So these were very sweeping powers, and it was really the purpose of the two English revolutions of the 17th century, the first one that resulted in the regicide and the second one that resulted in the sort of importation of William and Mary in 1688-9, were fought by parliamentarians to eliminate these prerogatives, or at least to subject them or to very, very fierce parliamentary control. There were lots of others that also were important. The king claimed a prerogative to appoint counselors at pleasure and regarded them as simply advisors who offered counsel rather than binding instructions. And all of this was disputed. Parliament, would claim the right to appoint the king's counselors and insist that all royal acts had to issue from the advice of these counselors, and so on. So it's a great clash between these two visions, this kind of royalist vision of an independent monarch in a coordinate scheme, that is to say, a monarch with his own independent prerogatives governing in conjunction with these two legislative branches, and an increasingly assertive parliamentarian theory, which would eventually become what we know as the Whig tradition, which asserted the supremacy of Parliament and increasingly wanted to conceive of the king as an executive, as a kind of pure executive, that is, someone who's just tasked with the function of enforcing the laws passed by Parliament.
Now that we understand the English Constitution, let's explore how its powers applied to the governance of British North American colonies, with a bit of a comparative history. Eric, how did England govern its North American colonies before the English Revolution? And what happened to their governance after the restoration of Charles II in 1660? I mean, how did the powers of Charles II differ from those of his father, Charles I, and grandfather, James I?
Well, this also is a great and very complex question. In general, the thing to appreciate, I think, in order to get going in the first instance, is that the various colonies that emerge in British America emerge at different times in very different guises and for different purposes. And so they have, very importantly, different governmental structures, although then there are some underlying similarities. So let me say a little bit about the differences, and I'll then say a little bit about the similarities, and then I'll get to the question of what changes when. The differences are some of the colonies are chartered colonies, that is where there were royal charters given to private trading companies, corporations, granting them lands and giving them various corporate chartered rights. And originally, the Virginia colony, the Virginia Company was of that kind. Before the revocation of the Virginia Charter, Massachusetts was of that kind, Rhode Island, Connecticut, and so on. There were other colonies that were proprietary colonies, where single great families or men were themselves the beneficiaries of a royal grant, giving them and their families, control over a particular territory. The key examples there would be Pennsylvania and Maryland. And then you had this additional kind of colony, which is a sort of a pure royal colony, where let's say the classic example would be New York, which didn't have a sort of official charter and came through conquest, sort of won from the Dutch and then assigned to the Duke of York, who then becomes James II, and then ultimately is established as a royal colony. So they have these different origins, and as a result of their different origins, they end up evolving somewhat different relations to the metropolis in Britain. So the standard model, I mean the one that's, let's say, most familiar, is a model in which there is a royal governor appointed by the crown, then a kind of upper house of a kind, some kind of approximation of the House of Lords, which was the colonial council that was appointed by the governor usually, and then some kind of elected assembly. And in order for a bill to become law, it would have to be approved by the governor, and then in most cases submitted for further approval to the Privy Council, acting through an institution called the Board of Trade, which was the kind of bureaucracy that governed the overseas colonies. And the Board of Trade would then, on behalf of the Crown, recommend either allowing or disallowing the law. And quite a lot of statutes, I mean, not a huge number, but certainly a number, were disallowed. So a statute could be passed by the Assembly, approved by the governor, sent for review to London, and then disallowed, which, again, the term that was used was the negative voice, that is, the Crown using its negative voice, or something like what we might call the veto. But it was different because in these cases the laws had already gone into effect in most cases. So a disallowance was, in essence, the kind of repeal of a law that in some cases had been on the books for a year or more. So that's the sort of canonical structure, and the other sort of analogous feature that was in common is that because these colonies were understood as crown colonies and the charters were royal grants, the understanding was that judicial appeals in the colonies would ultimately end up with what was technically called the king in council if they went all the way up. That is, the Privy Council would deal with final judicial appeals rather than the House of Lords, which would have been the case in Britain itself. So that's something like the kind of standard model, but there was a great deal of variety. So some colonies, Rhode Island, Connecticut, for example, and also Maryland, did not have the royal negative. I mean, that is to say, their bills were not submitted for allowance or disallowance in London. Some governors were elected rather than appointed, and so on. So there was, because the colonies had these very different origins, they evolved different structures and somewhat different relations to the mother country. The one major thing that changes after the English Revolution is that for the first time after the regicide, so during the 1620s and into the 1630s, Parliament, this increasingly assertive Parliament, particularly the House of Commons, is increasingly claiming a right to legislate for America, to govern American affairs by parliamentary statute. They're trying to govern American trade, let's say, with in relation to tobacco or the fishing industry. And in the period before the English Revolution, the Stuart monarchs, James and Charles I, whenever this would occur, would send their Secretary of State into the Commons to halt the proceedings and sort of announce, this is outside of your jurisdiction. You have no business here. These colonies are royal dominions. They're to be governed by the prerogative and according to charters granted at the King's pleasure, and Parliament has nothing to do with any of this. And they're able to hold Parliament at bay until the Revolution and the regicide and the execution of Charles I, and then when Parliament assumes complete control in the so-called Commonwealth period, or the interregnum, it's at that point that the Rump Parliament, as it was called, passes the first bill, the first law governing America, the Navigation Act of 1651, which remains in place in some form or other through the Revolution. and imposed very draconian limits on American imports and exports and sort of integrated America into an imperial political economy. And so the key fact was that although many of the prerogatives that Charles I had enjoyed were restored to Charles II, and Charles II in many ways was a very powerful monarch, the authority of Parliament over the colonies was accepted to some degree going forward, and Parliament began to involve itself much more aggressively as time went on in American affairs. And of course, the revolutionary generation of the 1760s and 70s would look back on this moment in 1651 as the sort of moment of original sin, the moment where it all went wrong, when these sort of rapacious parliamentarians got their hands on the colonies after they'd murdered their king.
Thank you for helping us refresh our English history. But let's fast forward back towards the American Revolution period, the 1760s and the 1770s, when Eric believes that some patriots start arguing for a royalist theory of representation. Again, that idea that the king, not Parliament, truly represents the people of British North America. Eric, would you tell us how the Patriots made a case that the monarch was a better representative of the people than that large representative body of Parliament?
Sure. Here they were really prompted to go back to a set of arguments that had been developed quite extensively and with great sophistication by Royalist political theorists in the middle 17th century. So as they realize that the culprit is Parliament, and they begin to see the crown as the solution rather than the problem, the idea is that the way to restore and repair the English Constitution is to strengthen the crown rather than weaken it, and to tame this tyrannical oligarchy as they saw it in Parliament. They go back to this, they sort of rediscover these earlier arguments, and they deploy them, quite straightforwardly and with great enthusiasm. And basically the argument, it has a kind of practical side and then a very theoretical side. So the practical side is, as an argument they take from these Royalist writers, which is that the king is going to be a safer repository of the liberties of subjects and the interests of subjects than the legislature, than an assembly. Why? Well, because the king's interest on this view is uniquely bound up with the interest of the realm as a whole. The king's interest is to see the whole realm prosper, and his incentive is to think, as we would say, with a very long time horizon, that is, to consider the long term rather than short-term political gain, because his overall objective is to pass the realm intact to his successor, to his heir. And so he will sort of shun partial and interested policies. He will shun short-term political stunts and forego these kind of immediate gains for longer-term gains. And the idea is that with respect to, in the case of a legislature, it's the reverse. Legislatures are made up of representatives who speak for specific constituencies. They will be partial, they will be factional, and they won't seek the common good. They'll be winners and losers, and influence peddling, and all the rest. And there'll be a great deal of short-term, short-sighted political maneuvering, and so the long-term sort of stable interest of the realm will be compromised. And they just apply this theory to the imperial context. That is, the idea is the king looks with equal favor, as they always repeated, on each of his dominions. He doesn't prefer any one to any other, and he will serve as a kind of impartial umpire, or what they called a superintending power, who would seek the well-being of the empire as a whole, and would not be subject to the sort of factional and partisan sort of instincts of the British legislature. And so that's the practical side. That's the sort of, how is it going to work best for us side. But there's also a theoretical argument in here, they need it also, about freedom. That is, because you might say, well, okay, it might be true, empirically speaking, that a monarch would sort of get you more stuff that you want than an assembly, but that might be true even while it's also true that you're a slave. That is, surely if you're governed simply at the say-so of a single person, you depend on an arbitrary and alien will, and you are therefore a slave. I mean, you might have a benign master who treats you really well, but that doesn't make you any less of a slave. And this was the argument they had to address, because parliamentarian political theorists in the 17th century had developed a very sophisticated, systematic argument that explained or promised to explain why a single person could never represent the people. From which it followed, so the idea of representation is that your representative is someone who speaks and acts in your name, so that if it's a representative power that makes the laws that govern you, then in some sense you can say you have agreed to these laws. That is, the laws are an expression of your will, in which case the fact that you are constrained to obey them doesn't compromise your freedom. So there were very high stakes in this argument. You had to show why the institutions of government were representative institutions, why you could see, as a subject, you could see your own will in the eventual laws. And the parliamentarian argument is you cannot do this if the king, not only if the king just makes laws by himself, but even if the king has a negative voice. If you require the king's permission through his assent to do whatever it is you'd like to do, you live at the grace and pleasure of a master, because only an assembly can represent the people. To represent the people, you have to look like the people. You have to be a kind of numerous assembly because the people are numerous. There has to be a kind of proportional representation of all the interests, geographical regions, professions, and so on, or as they would say, it should be a miniature of the people. You should be able to look at the miniature and form a correct idea of what the whole looks like. And if that's true, then the interests of the people and the interests of the legislature will be symmetrical, and any laws that result from that legislature or emerge from that legislature will be consonant with the will of the people. So that's the parliamentarian argument, or the Whig argument. It's the kind of the great political orthodoxy of the Whig tradition, is that only an assembly can represent the people for that reason. The Royalist position is to say that's totally wrong. What it is to represent someone is just to be authorized to speak and act on that person's behalf, like a lawyer. You know, your lawyer represents you in court. Lawyer doesn't have to look like you. We don't ask whether the lawyer looks like you. And likewise, a people can be represented by one person, a group of people. They can decide as a collective body to govern themselves by majority vote, in which case everyone would be a representative of the people in some sense. Any version of this is consistent with the theory of representation. So the people are at liberty to be represented by a king, by an assembly, or by some combination of the two. And in any case, as long as these institutions have been authorized, the people are represented, and the law is an expression of the will of the people. And the people, in being constrained to obey those laws, are therefore free. So that's the Royalist view. Probably the most famous statement of it was given by Thomas Hobbes in his Leviathan of 1651. But it's not an argument that's unique to Hobbes at all. It's just a kind of an orthodoxy in Royalist political thought. And this is the argument that American writers gravitate toward in order to make sense of their commitment to the royal prerogative. They have to explain why it is that granting the king these unprecedented sweeping powers that no English monarch had actually enjoyed or wielded for 100 years, why doing so would be consistent with their liberty. Well, the only way that you can square that circle is if you conclude that the king can be a representative of the people. And that's exactly what they conclude.
Now that we understand the theory, Eric, why do you think that some patriots preferred the idea that the crown and not Parliament should rule British North America?
Well, for some of the reasons that I was mentioning. They thought, first of all, they genuinely believed that the monarch would give them a much fairer shake than the legislature, the British legislature. The British legislature was elected by British subjects. I mean, we have to remember it was in fact elected by a tiny, tiny minority of British subjects. That is to say, roughly 1 in 9 or 1 in 10 Britons actually had the franchise. But nonetheless, the assembly that was elected in each parliament was beholden to a set of constituencies in Britain itself. And the American understanding was that these representatives were under a very, very strong incentive to impose burdens on America to remove them from their own constituencies. That is to say, there were lots of temptations to free riding here, to simply displacing burdens onto those who didn't send members into the assembly. Whereas the king would be impartial. The king would look to the well-being of the empire as a whole, and therefore be more favorable to what Americans took to be their sort of fair and equitable interest. But it was more than that. They genuinely became convinced that Parliament's jurisdiction over America was enslaving. That's to say, because Parliament, they concluded, they go through a very complicated set of arguments about this in the 1760s, which I'm going to skip and just get to the position they end up with, at least most of them. The position they end up with is that they were, in their founding period, connected only to the crown. They were royal dominions. And so they relate to Britain not as kind of motherland metropolis to dependent colony, but rather as equal dominions in an imperial monarchy. So the king is the sort of hub of the wheel, and each of his dominions is a spoke radiating outwards. So the king is king of Great Britain, but he's also Prince Elector of Hanover, because remember, his family were German princes. He was also, on this understanding, king of Massachusetts, king of Virginia, king of New York, and he governs each of these dominions, and these dominions are only connected to each other just insofar as they happen to share a monarch. But the British legislature is just that. It's the British legislature. The king governs Great Britain in conjunction with Parliament, and he governs Massachusetts in conjunction with the General Court, and Virginia in conjunction with the Burgesses, and so on. And that's the scheme that they agreed to in their charters, granting to the king these sweeping prerogative powers, the veto, the right to govern imperial commerce, and all the rest, granting it only to him. There had been no grant to Parliament, and so the idea is that Parliament, in exercising these authorities, is usurping royal power. And in the process is enslaving Americans, because Americans have not authorized Parliament to govern them. And if Parliament does govern them, that would put Americans in the position of being governed by an alien will, an unauthorized will, and that would be slavery.
The Royalist Revolution carried over into the constitutional debates of the 1780s. Eric, how did the Royalist notions of the Revolution, specifically the idea that the United States should have a strong executive, figure into the debates over the Constitution?
Well, they figured very prominently because, in many cases, the same figures who had pioneered this very prerogativist, we might say neo-Stuart, set of arguments about the imperial constitution in the later 1760s and earlier 1770s. And these are people like John Adams and Alexander Hamilton and James Wilson and Benjamin Rush and James Iredell and so on. These people continue to play an incredibly important role in American politics, and they become leading advocates for the new Constitution, and quite particularly for the presidency, and for a very sweeping conception of presidential power. And they themselves very frequently related the two, that is, explained what they took to be the continuity in their own thought. So, for example, James Wilson, who's sort of one of the major figures in my story, and I think a very, very neglected figure in general in the history of American constitutionalism and the history of American political thought, although there's been some excellent recent work on him. James Wilson, who is really unquestionably the architect of the presidency, gets up in the convention on June 1st of 1787 and makes the motion to create the presidency. And the sort of wording of the motion is itself very interesting. But the key point that I want to make just now is he offers this motion for the creation of a single executive who will be vested with the executive power, and also very sweeping prerogatives. Wilson wanted the president to have an absolute veto, that is, one that couldn't be overridden by a supermajority of Congress, wanted the president to have plenary power of appointment to executive offices without any role of advice and consent for the Senate, and so on. It was a very, very sweeping conception. And he's challenged almost immediately by Edmund Randolph of Virginia, who objects to the single executive on the grounds, as he says, that it's going to create a fetus of monarchy. And Randolph's argument in particular is about the Revolution. He says, look, the Revolution, as I understand it, was fought against the British Crown. We were trying to get rid of Crown power and executive corruption and tyranny. And that being so, it would be absurd and crazy for us to turn around and sort of snatch catastrophe from the jaws of victory. I mean, that is to say, we would be voluntarily going back exactly where we started, and the whole point of the Revolution was to get rid of this kind of power, and this is the kind of power that that Wilson's motion proposes to create. So Wilson gets up and responds by challenging directly Randolph's understanding of the revolution. He says, look, my understanding of the revolution is that the people of America never rebelled against the King of Great Britain, but rather against Parliament. And their quarrel was never with the unitary powers, he says, but rather with a corrupt multitude. So the revolution was never anti-monarchical. It was actually a revolution fought in defense of the royal prerogative against a tyrannical legislature. And for that reason, if we want to be consistent with revolution principles, if we want to actually sort of deliver on the promise of the revolution, we'll create exactly this kind of figure. That is, what we will do is create a chief magistrate to whom we assign all of those powers, those prerogative powers that we unsuccessfully urged George III to revive for the British monarchy in the imperial crisis. And so the understanding is that that's what the revolution was about. It was a campaign in favor of royal power and the royal prerogative. George III had refused to become the kind of king-emperor they wanted, and so they set about casting his replacement. And a great many of the most important figures in the convention and the ratification debates more broadly are quite straightforwardly defending this view, and they maintain all the way through the period their insistence on what the revolution was about and why it was that they and those of like mind had rebelled against Britain.
Eric, as you know, the ideas you present in the Royalist Revolution contradict the prevalent narrative we have about the American Revolution, which portrays the American patriots as men who were for legislative assemblies, not against them. So, Eric, if the patriots were really more conservative and wanted the king or chief executive to have more power, not less power, how did the narrative of the pro-legislature patriots arise and become so prevalent?
Well, the first thing I'd want to say is it's no part of my argument to suggest that the Patriots were conservative in any sort of recognizable sense of that term. Theirs was actually a very radical position, which is to say, the conservative party in the American Revolution were the Whigs, that is, particularly the Whigs who became Loyalists, who were offering a sort of full-throated defense of the settlement of the Glorious Revolution, the English Constitution as it had emerged and functioned for roughly the century between 1688-9 and the Revolution, the regime of the king in Parliament, this kind of regime of increasingly sort of robust parliamentary supremacy. So that was the conservative position. The Patriot position was quite radical insofar as they were defending a conception of monarchy and a view of the English Constitution that had become really impossible in Britain itself generations earlier. And this was sort of appreciated at the time. That is, their opponents in Britain were not accusing them of being Republicans or Democrats or anything of the kind. They were accusing them of being absolutists and Jacobites. That is, sort of defenders of absolute monarchy, or at the same time, Jacobites in the sense of those who remained loyal to the House of Stuart after the Glorious Revolution. Now, they were neither of those things, but the radicalism of their argument was clearly in that direction rather than in a kind of Republican or Democratic direction. So that's just a kind of a caveat about the use of the term conservative. But the question, it's a great question about what, as it were, goes wrong in our historical understanding. And there's evidence, incidentally, of this going wrong quite early. I mean, one of the passages I love that I cite in the book is a report of a comment by Rufus King, who was one of the delegates to the Constitutional Convention. He was representing Massachusetts in the convention. He ends up in New York. And he takes a very important set of notes in the convention, and among other things, it's in King's notes that we find recorded Wilson's comment about the origin of the revolution that I was just mentioning. But King becomes a senator and serves for a very long time. In fact, so long that he ends up overlapping in the Senate with Thomas Hart Benton, the ancestor of the artist, senator from Missouri. And they sort of become friends, and Benton writes a memoir of his time in the Senate in which he recalls a conversation with King And he recalls that King got into a discussion with him about the convention and said, look, the thing you have to understand, in essence, you young whippersnappers, you who've come of age after the revolution, you don't really understand the generation that made the revolution. And so you don't understand those of us who were in favor of a strong government, by which he means really kind of strong executive power, because you have never lived under a king, and you've now grown up in a republic where even the name of king has become hated. But it wasn't so with us. We grew up under a monarch, and we thought of ourselves as the king's most loyal and faithful subjects, and we waged the revolution not against the king, but against his parliament. So again, just echoing Wilson's remarks from the convention, which actually he himself had transcribed. It's a lovely moment. The point of that narrative, that sort of vignette, that reminiscence, I think, is that it was already clear at that point that a great deal of historical forgetting had taken place as the United States underwent extraordinary social and political changes, cultural changes, in the first half of the 19th century, particularly in the Jacksonian period, as the country undergoes something like a democratic revolution and emerges recognizably as some version of what we might call a democracy. And at that point, the urge to see the sort of seeds of that present in the revolutionary past were very powerful. That is, to see the revolution as somehow designed to bring about precisely that kind of new order, that kind of repudiation of monarchical power and the ancien regime in favor of a kind of democratic egalitarianism. But as people like King and the generation who had survived through the upheavals of the early 19th century recognized, a great deal of intellectual sort of territory had been covered in the intervening decades, and it was increasingly difficult for people to think their way back into the intellectual world of the 1760s and 70s. And in essence, this was a process that had already begun even earlier. And one of the vignettes that I offer in the book, really at the very end, is one that takes place in the first meeting of the Senate, the first session of the Senate after Washington's inauguration in 1789, when Adams is presiding as vice president, and the first order of business is to enter into the record the text of Washington's address. And Adams had, in sort of preparing the minutes, used the term "his most gracious speech" to characterize Washington's address, and that phrase, the most gracious speech, is the phrase that's used to describe the speech given by British monarchs before the opening of at the opening of Parliament. And it's always the King's most gracious speech or the Queen's most gracious speech still today. And the use of this phrase outraged one of the new senators, William Maclay of Pennsylvania, who became a very outspoken, sort of rabid opponent of the Washington administration, the Adams administration. And he sort of exclaims that this is a bit of royal ceremonial and pomp, and again, the revolution was fought against monarchical power, and so this should have no place here. And Adams responds by saying if he had thought that was what the revolution was about, he never would have drawn his sword. And it's a comment that really struck Maclay and led him to reminisce in a very interesting way about the nature of the revolution and the sort of difficulty of sort of thinking our way back into the mindset of the people who made it. So I think this particular kind of forgetting was already well underway in the very early years of the Republic. And of course, this question of the nature of the revolution, what it was about, and the particular character of the form of government that emerged from Philadelphia in 1787 would become, the major sort of fault line in the debate between Federalists and Jeffersonians and Republicans in the first decade of the life of the Republic. And so the debate would keep going for some time. I mean, it was John Adams who, also in 1789, the very year in which this incident about the most gracious speech takes place, that he's corresponding with a fellow delegate from the convention, Roger Sherman of Connecticut, and is asked to characterize the new form of government under the Constitution. What kind of government is it? And Adams's response, without any hesitation, is it's a limited monarchy.
Let's transition to the time warp. This is a fun segment of the show where we ask you a hypothetical history question about what might have happened if something had occurred differently or if someone had acted differently.
The time warp. Historians can't predict the future, but they can speculate about what might have been.
Eric, in your opinion, what might have happened if King George III had heeded the Americans' call to take up his defunct power of the negative voice?
It's a great question. I think, bearing in mind the difficulty of these kinds of counterfactuals, my favorite story about the exercise is a story that's possibly apocryphal, but I've heard it's actually true, that's told about Henry Kissinger, that he was giving his usual sort of Cold War talk someplace or other, I think possibly the Aspen Institute or someplace like that. And he'd given it 1,000 times, and he was just kind of sleepwalking through it, and then started fielding questions. And again, he'd heard every one of these questions over and over and was just kind of batting them back very effortlessly. And then this sort of little old lady raises her hand and says, Dr. Kissinger, my question is this: how do you think history would have turned out differently if it had been Khrushchev rather than Kennedy who was assassinated in 1963? And Kissinger paused and sort of thought, and he said, Madam, I've never been asked that question before, and I don't really know how to answer it, except to say that I think it is exceedingly unlikely that Aristotle Onassis would have married Mrs. Khrushchev. So I don't know that I can do much better than that in this case, but my guess is that George III would not have survived very long if he had actually tried to take up the American invitation. He was very aware of this. That is, he was very clear about what the Americans were offering. His subjects were very clear, and he insisted in famous letters, including a very famous one to Lord North in 75, that is, he said, I am fighting the battle of the legislature. I'm going to go down fighting the battle of the legislature. The Americans are sort of offering to increase the prerogatives of the crown and separate me from Parliament and turn me into an emperor, and I'm not going to do that. I'm going to go down with the ship fighting for the rights of Parliament. And the reason, first of all, was that he was himself a good Whig, at least of a kind, and regarded the powers that the Americans were offering as unconstitutional. But I think also he was an astute enough observer of history, British history in particular, to realize that if he walked out one day and announced that he was taking up the American invitation, that is, he was going to revive the veto, not only revive the veto in relation to parliamentary bills, which hadn't been used in generations, but wield it himself. Right, not through ministers, because that was the whole American point. The king should wield these prerogatives in his person, not through a parliamentary ministry. And he took upon himself the right to regulate American trade, again without Parliament, and alienate territories from the realm without Parliament, and all the rest. If he actually did all of that, his head would be on the block, within a month, I think he felt. And he was probably not wrong. And in fact, when he finally declares the colonies in rebellion, in his famous speech in October of 75, his address is greeted with euphoric responses all throughout Britain, and virtually every city and sort of guild corporation writes these, a congratulatory address, which is published in the newspapers, congratulating the king on being sort of above the temptation being offered to him by his American subjects. That is, they're offering this extraordinary unconstitutional increase in the royal prerogative to turn him into some kind of absolute monarch, but he, being a virtuous prince, has resisted and refused to take the bait. And I think it's pretty easy to see that that same constituency would have turned on him in a flash if he had shown himself open to rethink the entire English Constitution and re-empower the crown in the way that Americans wanted. It was sort of unthinkable at this point, and that is sort of demonstrated by the fact that, ironically, it's after the Revolution, I mean, during the period of the Revolutionary War and then in its aftermath, that George begins to try to assert some of the prerogatives that his American subjects were asking him to revive. He turns them down, but then as the war starts to go badly and he tries to take some kind of control of it, he almost, very nearly provokes a constitutional crisis in England just by summoning and addressing his own cabinet, which hadn't been done since Queen Anne, and then, in fact, thinks of using the royal negative in the sort of subsequent decade to prevent the passage of a bill emancipating Catholics. So it's a very interesting story, but I think the answer to your question is if he had tried to go the American way, it would not have gone very well.
George III gets a bad rap in America, but he's actually a fascinating individual to study because he followed the Enlightenment. He was studied on agriculture. And he's just a really interesting individual, regardless of his politics. Before we conclude, would you tell us what aspect of history or political thought that you are researching and writing about now?
Actually, the project I'm working on now is very different. It's much more philosophical than historical, and it's about the theory of justice. But there is some intellectual history in it as well. I'm very interested in the religious origins of some crucial concepts and arguments in contemporary liberal political philosophy, and I've become particularly interested in the relationship between the sort of religious formation of John Rawls, the most massively influential liberal political philosopher of the 20th century, certainly in the English-speaking world, and increasingly interested in his sort of religious formation. He was, as a young man, a theology student who was planning to become an Episcopal priest, and I've become very interested in the relationship between his distinctive religious ideas and the sorts of arguments that he makes basic to contemporary political philosophy. So that's what I'll be thinking about.
And where is the best place to look for more information about you, your work, and how to get in contact with you?
Probably just my website at the Harvard Government Department.
And we'll have a link to that in the show notes page for this episode. Eric, thank you so much for helping us brush up on our English history and for helping us consider how that history may have influenced the American Revolution and the drafting of our Constitution.
Thank you very much.
Our conversation with Eric, in many ways, is an extension of the one we just had with Carolyn Harris in episode 38 about Magna Carta. And it's an extension because Magna Carta established centuries-old precedents about the powers that a king should have and how he should govern his people. It also provided the king's subjects with precedents about when it would be okay to foment civil war or revolution because the king overstepped or misused his powers. And many patriots looked towards those precedents when they decided whether or not that they should get involved with the American Revolution. Now, this wasn't planned, but it is fortuitous that Eric mentioned Vice President John Adams's wish to thank George Washington for his most gracious speech. And it's fortuitous because that's the topic of next week's episode. Next week, we will talk all about the presidential title controversy of 1789 with Kathleen Bartoloni Toison in episode 40. You can find more information about Eric, his book, The Royalist Revolution, plus everything we talked about today on the show notes page for this episode, benfranklinsworld.com/039. Have you signed up for the Taxes, Riots, and Revolution tour yet? This is our Ben Franklin's World meetup here in Boston on August 15th, and this tour commemorates the 250th anniversary of the Boston Stamp Act riots. You can find more information about this tour as well as signing up for it by visiting benfranklinsworld.com/meetup. Would you like to receive access to Poor Richard's Club or the show notes for every episode right in your inbox? If so, text BFWorld to 33444, and you can sign up there for the Franklin Gazette, which will bring next week's show notes as well as every other episode show notes right into your inbox, and it'll also provide you with a link so you can join Poor Richard's Club on Facebook. Finally, what do you think of Eric's ideas? Do you think that the American Revolution was a revolution against Parliament instead of King George III? Post your answers on the show notes page for this episode in Poor Richard's Club, where I know there's going to be a lively debate about this topic. Or email them to me, liz@benfranklinsworld.com. I guess you could tweet them to me if you can fit it in 140 characters. And my Twitter handle is @LizCovart.
And remember, never leave till tomorrow that which you can do today.